Let me start with a small story. An American businessman was at the pier of a small coastal Mexican village when a small boat with just one fisherman docked. Inside the small boat were several large yellowfin tuna. The American complimented the Mexican on the quality of his fish and asked how long it took to catch them. The Mexican replied, only a little while. The American then said, well, why didn't you stay out longer and catch more fish? The Mexican said, well, I've got enough to support my family's immediate needs. The American then asked, well, what do you do with the rest of your time? The Mexican fisherman said, I sleep late, fish a little, play with my children, take siesta with my wife Maria, stroll into the village where I sip wine and play guitar with my amigos. I have a very full and busy life, senor. The American scoffed, I'm a Harvard MBA, and I could help you. You should spend more time fishing, and with the proceeds, buy a bigger boat. And with the proceeds from the bigger boat, you could buy several boats. Eventually, you'd have a fleet of boats. Instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you would sell directly to the processor, eventually opening your own cannery. You would control the product, the processing, the distribution. You would have to leave this small coastal village, move to Mexico City, then LA, then New York City, where you will run your expanding enterprise. The Mexican fisherman said, but how long will that take, senor? To which the American replied, 15, 20 years. But what then, senor? Oh, that's the best part. When the time's right, you announce an IPO. You sell your company, stock to the public, and become very rich. You will make millions. Millions, senor? Then what? The American said, then you would retire. You'd move to a small coastal village where you would sleep late, fish a little, play with your kids, take siesta with your wife, stroll into the village in the evenings where you could sip wine and play guitar with your amigos. You see, adding value isn't always necessarily the right thing to do. It can come down to perspective. I've spent my entire life trying to find ways to add value to milk. I realized this when I was putting this talk together. Even when I was only knee-high on my grandfather's dairy farm in rural Pennsylvania, he used to skim off the fat, sell it to the neighbors for, I'm sure, was a price that was a bit higher than it cost him to produce it. My father sold and installed universal milking machine equipment where the goal was to harvest more milk for less labor, in other words, less money. That's how we used to wash bulk tanks, by the way, when I was a kid. I said, we need some automation here. In my time as a design engineer, a director of R&D and founding CEO of SensorTech, I was working for and with a number of milking machine equipment companies designing equipment that could harvest more milk for less cost on farm. And I'm now running my own business, Quantech, where we've discovered a new uses for bioactive fractions from milk in the human and animal pharmaceutical and nutraceutical areas. I think I'm amongst mixed company here when I say that milk is one of nature's most remarkable products. We've already heard from Martin, who spoke about using it to feed the world, and Pierre, who talked a bit about where it might come from, and we're going to hear some really good talks this afternoon as well. My charge was to shed some light on what it means to add value to milk. This is a phrase we throw around quite loosely in the industry, but what does it mean? I'd like to dig into this a little bit as an introduction for you before I share with you what I think are 3 key areas that we all collectively as an industry can do and consider before we decide how, or even if we want to, add value to milk. Like I said, adding value is a phrase we usually throw around. It's a rather obvious concept if you're in the business of making money. You can't make a profit unless you've added value to something. Take breakfast this morning. How many of you had some form of egg? Geez, you guys aren't big egg eaters. Well, I'll use the analogy anyway, shall I? A raw egg in its shell on the supermarket shelf already has a lot of value added to it. You could have had some chickens at home, fed them, raised them, went out in the morning, stuck your hand under them, got your egg. Much like the Mexican and the fish. But someone has done this for you. He's cleaned it, they've processed it, sized it, packaged it, hopefully ensured it's free of salmonella, and transported it to the supermarket shelf. When you pick it up and put it in your basket, you're unconsciously agreeing that the value added to it was worth what you're paying for it. Let me just say that to truly add value to anything, you have to do something that costs you less than someone else is willing to pay for it. I'll be clear, you could add value in non-monetary ways, but for the purpose of this presentation, I want to stick to that definition. To truly add value to anything, you have to do something that costs you less than someone else is willing to pay you for it. And there's only really two ways to do this. You can directly compete with something that already exists in the market, or you can create something new that no one has discovered or imagined yet. The first is done every day. One example of this is a company coming out with a new brand of ice cream and some interesting new flavors and snazzy packaging. These things tend to be incremental, lower risk, and hence lower value-added ideas, but can still be quite profitable and useful. The second is done less often, of course. It's more difficult, usually requires new thinking, voyeurism, or whatever that word was Renee used. And I'll show you some examples of these as we go on. But milk is used for a variety of purposes. Let me start by just outlining those three categories. Nutrition. You see value in the fat, protein, or carbohydrate essential nutrient content as a source of nutrition. Milk's a wonderful source. It provides 16% of the daily protein needs. Secondly, you could see milk as a source of pleasure. You see value in the taste or texture. Yup last night talked about how he liked the cheese on his pizza. Probably not so nutritious, but think ice cream, whipped cream, or those sorts of things. The category I'm most interested in these days is function. You've been convinced there's a functional benefit to one or more components of milk. Think the whey protein concentrate you drink after having a workout at the gym, or the lactoferrin supplements you might take in the morning, or the calcium that's going to help you build stronger bones. And perhaps there's some other categories as well, but I think these three are the main ones. So recognizing these three categories, how do we go about finding a way to add value to this product? Which brings me to my first point. In order to truly add value to milk, we have to make sure the idea really matches a market need. Now this sounds pretty obvious, we talk about that all the time too, but it doesn't always necessarily get considered, and I'm at fault with that quite often. I'm going to use some practical examples from my own experiences over the past 6 years to demonstrate this, along with some others. A few years ago, an enthusiastic milk entrepreneur from New Zealand launched a carbonated milk drink called Mo Milk. He launched a campaign with his first two flavors, cola and lemonade. Now, I was part of the panel that sampled these products, and I can tell you they weren't really that nice. And apparently I wasn't the only one, because a little while later they were pulled from the market, a seeming failure. We didn't hear about this guy for another 3 or 4 years. Well, lo and behold, a month ago, a new press release comes out, printed that said he was relaunching. And the reason? Well, he said he had gotten the flavors all wrong. He said that customers back in 2010 liked the concept, but they didn't want a cola or lemonade flavored drink. They wanted a milk flavored carbonated milk. They told him that if somebody wants to buy a cola drink, they'd go buy a Pepsi or a Coke. So his relaunch this year changed the flavors, and I hear he's really doing well with this. So recognizing that there's a market need there, but getting it right was a key thing for him. Another practical example of this working from New Zealand. There are others, but I know this company well. Back in the mid-'70s, a small dairy cooperative in New Zealand called Tatua spent 4 years coming up with an idea that they could take the fat from milk, which is often used by housewives in that time to whip up and create a topping for desserts. And they wondered, well, what if we put this in a can in a way that it came out pre-whipped? It could save a lot of time. Well, this ended up to be the introduction of a new category of a whipped cream in a can concept, and it was still less expensive to buy cream and put some elbow grease into it and whip it up. But customers were willing to pay the margin above what it cost Tatua to do this, and now it's one of the biggest categories. There's hardly anywhere you can go in the world and not find this on the supermarket shelf. Brings me to my second point. I want to start here by saying, and we've heard this already a little bit, milk from dairy cows is expensive. And number two, it's not going to get a lot cheaper. We can cut costs, but it's an expensive ingredient. It's one of the more expensive sources of proteins in the world, particularly if we're focusing on dairy cow breeds as the source. A glass of milk contains 8 grams of protein per 250 mils. That glass of milk costs 50 cents in New Zealand. Compared to 8 grams of ground beef or mince, that would cost about 8 cents. So you're looking at quite a big discrepancy as a source of protein to feed a world if you're talking about milk. So if we're to attempt to add value to an already expensive source, you have to find niche areas that can support the added value. If you look at the infant formula business in China, which I've just come back from last week, it's only for the wealthy who can afford a short supply of it. And if you look at the lactoferrin supplements, or any natural-derived supplements for that matter, they're being bought what I like to call the worried wealthy well of the world. Let me start an example of this that didn't work for us. In 2006, we discovered a novel use for a fraction of milk. We discovered that if you keep the whole suite of immune defense proteins in milk together, rather than separating them, all those proteins, including lactoferrin and numerous others, you get an impressive 10 to 100-fold increase in broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity and anti-inflammatory activity. Add to this a substantial antioxidant activity, and we had a fairly interesting ingredient that we patented and tried to use. We're still using it. But where do you market such a thing? Well, we had ideas from infant formulas to mastitis treatment for cows. We were even rubbing it onto dogs' itchy skin. And we were putting it into gums for oral care. But basically, we were doing anything anybody could come up with as an idea. One idea that came along to us was a line of dog treats for oral and skin health. We agreed to put our ingredient into these treats. The products got manufactured, put onto Petco shelves in the US, and died a quick death. Why? Our ingredient was too expensive for the market need. It couldn't be added in the right quantities to be effective, and there wasn't enough margins in the application to support any more clinical trials for us. Bottom line is that we failed to consider how the high value we had added into finding and proving this ingredient would actually fit with a real market need. Now, there was and still is a market need there. That's the deceptive part. The problem is that there wasn't a value fit between what we were doing and the market need. So when you're looking for an area to add value to milk, you have to make sure the value you're planning to add is capable of being absorbed by the market. Another example from New Zealand. A few years after the aerosol creams, Tatua decided that one of the minor proteins from milk called lactoferrin would have a good market on its own, separated from milk and freeze-dried as a functional ingredient. Apparently, mother's breast milk is lactoferrin, but infant formulas in the day didn't have enough to match the breast milk. Well, long story short, the global market for lactoferrin now is swamping supply, and prices have just absolutely skyrocketed. They were able to match a market need in a niche area that could support the added value. Now, they had a few fits and starts along the road, but today the global market for lactoferrin is nearing 100 ton per year, with a price that's just eclipsed US $650 a kilo. I know that because I tried to buy some a month ago. It about broke the bank. I think the sports powder category is another good example of this. Whey used to be a throwaway waste stream from dairy processing, and today the sports powder category is worth a small 450 million US dollars. I'd still call this a niche, just a big niche. Why? Well, the worried wealthy well of the world are obsessed with looking better and growing stronger, and once the link was made between milk whey proteins being a good source of amino acids, the connection was made. And what used to be a waste stream is now sold for around a lot of added value with a market cap of 750,000 tons per year. Our IDP ingredient is not likely to reach those sorts of magnitudes, but I think we're on a similar path with using IDP to find a niche market in treating acne. We've just completed our second clinical study on using IDP for acne treatment. The approved actives in the US are benzoyl peroxide and salicylic acid for a $1.5 billion US market. One dries the skin and the other strips it off, both creating quite a lot of irritation. If you've had any teenage sons or daughters that use these things, they're quite harsh. We've targeted our ingredient at being a naturally derived alternative for effective treatment of acne without being harsh and in fact being anti-inflammatory and capable of being used on sensitive skin. Now, the reason an expensive milk-derived ingredient can be used for this market is that the value of finished acne treatment products is high enough to absorb the costs and still provide a margin. On the other side of the fence is our experience with trying to use IDP for treating dandruff. You can see I've made a lot of mistakes here. It's very effective antimicrobial against the cause of dandruff, Malassezia furfur, as you can see in this left-hand slide where we've dropped some IDP. However, one of the effective approved actives is zinc, a very inexpensive ingredient with no unpleasant side effects. So there were no compelling reasons why any dandruff treatment manufacturer would even use an expensive milk ingredient as an alternative to what's already in the market. So my main point here is that some upfront research is always required to ensure you have a high-value niche that matches your value-added dairy concept. Now, I've been focusing on the dairy cow, which produces about 730 million tons of milk per year. I think it was 850 before, but around about the same number. I'd like to touch here on some other dairy species that are milked commercially, because we're seeing a growing nutritional and functional trend worldwide toward developing high-value niche products from other species. Goats and sheep. Sheep produce 9.2 million tons of milk per year. Goats produce about 2% of the world's milk supply, or 15.5 million tons per year. However, on a worldwide basis, there are more people who drink goat's milk from any other single animal. Now, I'm sure much of that is drunk by people who really can't afford a value-added product. However, are there opportunities to milk more goats, milk more sheep, add more value, and sell these products to those who can afford it? We've seen that some of these animals perhaps are even more efficient at making milk than dairy cows. I think the Chinese goat infant formula market growth curve would say, yes, there are some good opportunities there. Camels. Let me give some credit to Professor Reuven Yagel from Israel for this information. Camel milk has been known for thousands of years as a food and for alleviating illnesses from India to South Africa. However, research in camels was almost non-existent until 1982. Then milk became a central theme for explaining camels' survival in desert areas. Turns out camel's milk has a composition that is suitable for nutrition under extreme climatic conditions and isn't affected by the type of vegetation that they eat. It became such a niche thing that in 2000, a camel milk project was selected for Expo 2000 as one of 200 projects around the world. And in 2005, Scientific American reported the use of camel antibodies, which they called nanobodies, as a possible breakthrough in helping a range of conditions such as diabetes or food allergies. Water buffaloes. Buffalo produce around 92 million tons of milk per year and supplies the dairy needs of half the populations of India and the Philippines. An interesting little company in New Zealand called Claycomb has started milking these animals, as you see there on the right, and making some stunning buffalo products, really adding value. Good example of not having to invent new things, but just new ways of thinking about doing things. Horses and donkeys. Kummis is a fermented dairy product traditionally made from mare's milk and remains important, very important to the peoples of the Central Asian steppes. And here's an article on the right from a month ago advertising donkey milk as having benefits similar to human breast milk. How about deer milk? Popular in Arctic regions, has a high 22% fat content that's used for high energy food. And even in New Zealand, here's a recent article about how red deer milk is being converted into a high-value, high-bioactive cheese. Healthy cheese? Maybe a cross-pollination of two categories there. Basically, if it has teats, somebody's going to be milking it. The 22% deer milk seems almost like skim milk compared to dolphins' 33%, or the 53% fat content of fur seal milk. Now, I went searching for whale milking equipment. I thought some of these milking machine companies needed a new challenge. And I found it. After the conference, Google killer whale milking, and you'll find a beautiful video from Portugal where they're actually milking killer whales. I don't have time to show it to you, so enjoy that in your own time. So my first 2 points, we've got to match market needs, and we've got to find a niche. Now, I stewed on what I'd use as my third point for the talk, and a number of options, but I settled on what I felt was a real challenge to us collectively as an industry, and that revolves around integration of the value chain. Historically, the dairy value chain has been quite integrated. Farmers milk their animals, they own the dairy company, which started small, a group of neighbors perhaps, and they slowly grew as the demand for their products expanded. Today, I think the picture is much different, particularly in developed dairy countries. The value chain from farmer to processor to marketer to consumer has become much less integrated. And I think there are ways we as an industry can think about adding value simply by looking for ways to bring this back together again. Synlait, a company from New Zealand, is making a night milk skim milk powder. I think this is happening in Europe too. but I'm not going to debate the merits of this product. It's early days, but Sinlay farmers have had to cooperate with the company to milk their cows at night with the sole purpose of increasing the melatonin content of milk. Sinlay couldn't do this on their own. They needed the cooperation of their suppliers. The best example of this is an old company, and it's not a well-known company. Stolly Milk is probably the best examples of involving most, if not all, of the dairy value chain in producing a world-first product. If you have the chance, have a read of this inserted reference, which gives a whole detailed story of Stolly Milk. If you're not familiar with the product, Stolly Milk is produced from cows in New Zealand that are specifically immunized once a year before calving to produce antibodies in milk that are specific to certain antigens important to human health. Why is this an interesting product, an example of adding value by integrating the chain? Well, firstly, it's an early example of a functional nutraceutical product before the name was even invented. We're talking 30 years ago. And it involved the entire value chain from development on the farm through special processing, through government agencies, through marketing, through clinical testing. It even required specialized processing, packaging, and distribution and marketing to be developed to sell this unique product, and involved outside-the-box thinking on behalf of New Zealand's Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and special considerations by the Ministry of Health. It's a lengthy story, one worth modeling, I think, new value-added targets after. So definitely have a read of it. Bottom line is that a product concept that was spawned in the early 1900s, picked up back in the 1950s by a guy named Ralph Stoley from Ohio, trialed unofficially for about 30 years before becoming a full-fledged development joint venture between Ralph's U.S. company and a number of New Zealand companies and organizations in 1989. It's a product range that's still on the market today, targeted toward a number of human conditions, including diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, with approved health claims in many countries, including the U.S. and in Asia. They have 100 unique dairy herds in New Zealand registered to produce this special milk. A great number of opportunities in this space exist today using modern robotic milking technology. I think this offers a number of possibilities that don't exist with batch milking. In the past, we've conducted a project looking to develop on-farm technologies to separate milk components. We developed and patented some concepts integrating robotic milking with this specially designed robot we had here that would pull lactoferrin out cowside. We yielded higher quality proteins using less processing steps. We're pretty excited about it. Unfortunately, this project is on hold due mainly to an uncooperative dairy processing sector that's kind of pigeonholed itself into centralized processing dogma. I think there's amazing opportunities if we as an industry can work together towards some of these things. Another hot topic, non-pasteurized milk. I believe that opportunities still exist in this whole field, but there's solutions that require the entire dairy value chain in order to make this succeed. I think we can get non-pasteurized milk into the mouths of consumers in a way that's 100% safe. But the processing companies can't do it on their own. Dairy farmers can't do it on their own. Government can't do it on their own. We've got to work together to make this happen. Let me finish by tying back into the theme of the conference. Can we feed the world a growing population with dairy? Perhaps we can, but I think it takes another approach to adding value to milk. A good example of this, Dairy News Solutions, is a New Zealand initiative out of the Waikato Innovation Park, where my office is located in Hamilton, New Zealand, that's taking the best of New Zealand design technologies, which have been historically designed around low-cost, low-input dairy production, and they're taking this as a collective into lower socioeconomic countries. They've been working with overseas governments such as Colombia to set up low-cost dairy production systems that include the whole value chain on one massive land area, from calf rearing to crop production to dairy processing, in order to produce low-cost food for local people. This is a little bit different than the big dairy farms in China, where they're big corporate farms done to make more money. These are done specifically to teach people in these countries how to milk cows. Now, the New Zealand companies that are participating in this aren't losing money, but because there's less links in the value chain and they're all working together, they're all able to do this with the support of these overseas governments. Classic example of giving a man a fish and feed him for a day, teach him to fish and feed him for a lifetime. In this case, we're giving a man some milk and feed him for a day, teach a man to milk and feed his community for a lifetime. So I think it can be done, but it's going to take an integrated approach from us as an industry to make it happen. In conclusion, can I encourage all of us to think more seriously about how and why we're looking to add value to milk? Is your idea focusing on nutritional, taste, or functional purposes? And all three can be in the added value category. But you need to find a market need that fits, and you need to find a market niche that can sustain that added value. And I've highlighted what I think are some great opportunities, and I've just picked a few. There's many others, to add value by thinking outside your specific part of the dairy value chain.